Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast, which, by the way, is 4 years old this month. It's so hard to believe. Today's episode with dietitian Zach Cordell, it was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it. We talk about food and faith and culture, but a lot of other stuff too. In fact, about halfway through, my husband kind of makes a cameo, and I was going to cut it out, but I left it in for you. Hopefully you get a little giggle out of that as well. Just a couple of announcements. If you're attending today's Dietitian Spring Symposium in Scottsdale in May, please check out my nutrient density messaging workshop. You know, nutrient density or nutrient dense is a common term that we see in the dietary guidelines, and we might use it in nutrition communications. But is it really the most meaningful term we can use? And it depends on who your audience is and what the context is and what type of communication platform you're using. So we're going to roll up our sleeves and get all into that at my messaging workshop. So check it out. I've got a link on my show notes at soundbitesrd.com for you to find out all the information. And also, of course, stay tuned for more food for thought topics and guests coming up in May. And I have just a couple of very brief announcements from my partner, the American Association of Diabetes Educators. So I'm just going to give them to you now instead of at the end of the show. So the early bird deadline to register for AADE 19 is April 26th. So you can go to aade19.org to get the best rate before rates go up. Also, just a reminder, there's a variety of free resources available for both healthcare professionals and patients or people with diabetes. All you need to do is go to diabeteseducator.org/educator tools for the healthcare professional resources, and diabeteseducator.org/living with diabetes for people with diabetes. They also have Spanish language resources at diabeteseducator.org/Spanish. So enjoy today's show. I hope you have as much fun with it as Zach and I did. Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And on the show, I delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition. And today, we are talking about food, nutrition, science, and faith. My guest today is Zach Cordell. He's a professor, a podcaster, a public speaker, and an author. Zach approaches food behaviors with individuals by helping them understand the culture that influences them. Welcome to the show, Zach.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk with you about this very interesting topic. I know that you're somewhat of a new podcaster, and I'm so excited because there are so many more dietitians getting into the podcast space, and we really need that because, let's face it, there's a lot of folks out in that arena who really don't have any business talking about nutrition, but they are.
Wait, you're trying to tell me you want people to have credible sources?
Yes. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, that's kind of needy.
I know.
No, but I agree.
If I could wave a magic wand, right?
Yeah, right.
So I remember you and I first got connected when I was speaking at Fancy on podcasting and learned about your new podcast. Well, I'm calling it new, but is it a year old yet?
Seasoned, man. It's been since, I believe, June was whenever I launched it. So yeah, I mean, it's still new. I'm a young podcaster.
Okay. Yes. And I've been doing it for almost 4 years, but I still learn something new. Every interview, every show, almost every day, to be honest with you. It's a little mind-blowing. But your podcast is called The Latter-day Saint Nutritionist, and we're going to talk about that a lot. But there's a lot of different things that I want to ask you, and the theme of this is really the faith component and the culture that influences our habits, our lives. But what I'd like to start off with a little bit about your background and how you got interested in nutrition. I've done a little research on you, and I know that your father was a big reason that you went into nutrition.
Do you have like a Secret Service person out there just like checking people's backgrounds?
I do my homework.
Yes, my dad did play quite a role in me getting into nutrition. So I don't know if you knew this, but I first got introduced into nutrition from Weight Watchers, or WW, because whenever I was in high school, I was a husky boy, but my dad was a big guy, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to like do this with my dad, and this is going to be like our thing. We're going to get healthy together.
About how old were you when you thought that?
17.
Okay.
So we went to Weight Watchers. It's a good organization. They have a lot of useful tools. It's really helpful in doing nutrition education. From all the things that I can see, it's not necessarily promoting diet mentality, though weight is a focus. I mean, weight isn't the enemy, and it is a useful tool. And so it was a good experience to be able to do that. And I learned that my dad knew a lot about nutrition. Even though he was overweight, he still understood nutrition pretty well. And I think that's one thing that we do a discredit to people that are overweight or obese. We're like, well, if they just knew. It's like, well, a lot of them know a lot of things, and more so than people that are skinny that have never had to deal with any issues with their weight.
Absolutely.
And so that's how I got into it. And then I started studying in college, thinking I was going to be training triathletes. And then I was like, you know what, I can do more good than this. No offense to training triathletes. I think that's excellent. But
it wasn't hitting the spot for you.
Right. There was just more that I thought that I could do. And so I started looking into nutrition, really interested in like international nutrition and how the nutrient deficiencies could play a role, food insecurity could play a role, famines, politics, all of those things influenced what was going on. And then as I got into my master's, I was looking into more the Native American population, because that's a very interesting place to be, because they have a rich history of health. But whenever their food system changed, their diets changed, their behaviors changed, their
culture changed.
Their entire livelihood and culture, just shifted. And they have some of the highest rates of diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol because of those issues. And it kind of, if you look at it, the American diet kind of follows suit with what the Native Americans experienced. So the Native Americans experienced a big bump in those lifestyle diseases, and then the rest of the American population just kind of followed suit. And so from there, I realized that it's really just culture, that I am interested in like the culture behind what is causing people to do what it is they do. And that's kind of where I got to where I am now, in that I'm a nutrition professor. That is my full-time job, but I am a per diem clinical dietitian and host a podcast that talks about food and faith and the culture that comes along with that.
Great. And you're also a public speaker and an author. Your new, quote unquote, new book is The Creation Code. So we're going to talk about that as well. But tell me a little bit about where you teach and what you teach and what it's like working with those students.
Yeah, so I teach at Daytona State College in Daytona Beach, Florida, and there's a satellite campus that they have in a town just north of there that's in Palm Coast. And so I teach at the junior college, teach nutrition courses to nursing students and to the general population. So we don't have a dietetics program where we're raising other dietitians, though I do have students who will graduate with an AA or an AS from Daytona State and then head to different colleges to go into dietetics. And so the majority of the students that I teach are not individuals that are necessarily focused in the sciences unless they're going into nursing. But it's a really interesting, I guess I would say, girth of students, where I have students that are 13 years old and I have students that are 60 years old. And so I have a lot of opportunity to discuss health from a lot of different viewpoints. And I have the 60-year-olds that'll testify to my 13-year-olds and be like, I used to think I was just like you and I would always be thin and I would always be fit. And then I stopped working out and had a couple babies, and now my body's a little bit different. So you need to listen to this guy. And I'm like, well, thank you. That's the best like I could ever ask for, is that my students are telling other students to listen to me because I'm speaking the truth.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. So it sounds like they're fulfilling a requirement, or maybe they have an interest, but yeah, they're not getting a degree in nutrition.
Not yet.
Right. You might inspire them to.
I'm working to shift some of them into dietetics.
Well, and I've interviewed tons of dietitians, both for my blog and my podcast, and just talking with dietitians along the way. That is oftentimes what you hear is, yeah, I just took this nutrition course and it really piqued my interest and led to this great career. So, you have that opportunity to change lives in many ways.
Yeah. And I honestly was one of those students. I don't know how well you did your research, Melissa, but my first nutrition class, I had a professor and my dad had just started dialysis.
Because your father had diabetes.
Yeah, he had type 2 diabetes. He had renal failure and hypertension. And so metabolic syndrome was there. And that first nutrition class, the professor was like, oh, well, we'll talk about all these other things. And somehow dialysis came up. My dad had just started. I didn't know what it was. And she was like, usually the life expectancy of a person that started dialysis that's non-compliant is going to be like 5 to 7 years. And all I heard was, my dad's going to die in 5 to 7 years.
Right.
And as a young college kid, you're like, wait, what did you just say? And so I talked to her after class, and I was asking her like pretty pointed questions. And she said, do you know somebody that is in dialysis? And I told her that my dad was, and she kind of started backpedaling a little bit. And I was like, if that's what it is, that's what it is. Like, I'm not asking you to change the facts, but I just want to understand more so what's going on.
Right. And you went into the nutrition arena with this Weight Watchers experience with your father, really, I think, with a head start, because you already kind of knew it's not just the knowledge. It's about so much more.
Right. And that's really where the culture comes into it, right? There's the socioecological model, which shows that you are only a part of what is shaping the decisions that you're making about your food. Your families influence it, your friends influence it, your work environment influences it, whether you have a microwave at work or not, that influences it. And then let alone what the government says about what is okay to eat and what is not okay. Like, horse isn't necessarily illegal, but it's not socially acceptable to eat horse. So most people don't, right? So there's so many layers of what influences what you eat.
Absolutely. Well, I recently did an interview with Connie Riggs, who is a dietitian and a certified diabetes educator, and really focuses her career on the cultural aspects of diabetes and food and health. And so we talked about decreasing that cultural distance between patients and healthcare professionals. And I think we're going to talk about some of that today as well. And you mentioned culture and just our environment. I also recently did an interview about DNA test that I took that's similar to 23andMe, but it focuses on your weight. And so, nutrigenomics, we're learning a lot more about, are you more likely to have a sweet tooth? Are you less likely to be able to have impulse control around fatty foods and things like that? So we know at the end of the day.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, for those of us who, we're trying to help either the public or patients one-on-one, clients, and so on, family and friends, knowing that it's a multifaceted issue.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing about my class is that we'll have students that'll come in and we talk about weight bias and we talk about body positivity. And one of the things they'll say is they're like, well, why don't obese people just stop eating? And and I point out, well, that's called anorexia, and we don't recommend that for anybody of any size, actually. But it's not just like put the food down.
Right.
Is it like you just got off the phone with your mom and you and your mom have a rough relationship, and so every time you get off the phone with her, you're like, better hit up that Cheesecake Factory, right? There's so many different things that influence why you do what you do, that whenever you make this simple recommendation of like, well, just eat more vegetables, it's like, well, yeah, I get that.
Right. Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So how did faith become a focus for you? I know that we're going to be talking about culture, and I know that faith is a big part of your podcast. I mean, the title is The Latter-day Saint Nutritionist, and, it's not just for Latter-day Saints. But when did you kind of see that gelling for you, or see that light that faith was going to be a big part of your nutrition approach?
That's a good question. So I didn't really think about faith in terms of like my approach to nutrition, probably until I finished my master's about 3 years ago. And it was at that point I was like, so literally, it's everything that we do. And faith has been a part of my life growing up. I served as a missionary for my church for about 2 years. And so I understand the role that has played in my life. And we talk about it in terms of like, okay, well, when you're this old, this is what you like, you're going to get married. And whenever you're this old, you're going to have kids. And those are some things that are culturally put out there by different faiths or different groups. And yes, that can change within different family settings. But it really started to click with me whenever I would be studying different faiths and just look at how whenever you go into different faiths, you might be avoiding certain foods, or you might be focusing on certain foods. So like in Judaism, you have kosher. In Islam, you have halal, right? So there's different religious dietary practices. And even within the Seventh-day Adventist or the Latter-day Saint community, there are different dietary, not necessarily rules, but recommendations and the ways that they view food, right? And so I started at that point to kind of put things together, but I've always been the person that's tried to figure out, how does this apply to me? And so whenever I'm reading through like scriptures or doctrinal teachings or different things from any place, I'm like, how does this apply to the way that I see the world? So being a Latter-day Saint, or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was looking at it and I would read through and I'd see something. I'm like, that's a nutrition principle. Like that's the same practice that you would recommend for somebody in nutrition. And so as I started to look at it more and more, there are principles that we can see in our lives that transcend specific topics, right? Mm-hmm. So you can look at religion, and the recommendation for religion is like, you go to church every Sunday, right? And in terms of food and faith, you can twist that into, so we go to church every Sunday to renew the way that we are looking at the world through the lens of faith, right? Whereas with food, maybe we need to go through those things where we have reminders of how are we viewing our food and how does it help our bodies, rather than just going in and going all out trying to follow this one diet so that you can lose weight, but taking a step back and saying, is this still where I'm wanting to go, and adjusting how you look at things.
Right. So it's more about a belief system and a relationship with food. Why do you think we don't talk about faith very much? It seems a little taboo.
Yeah.
I mean, I have my own thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear, because I'm sure you get this question a lot. You think about this a lot. You talk about faith a lot. What type of response do you get from people, and why do you think we're not talking about it more?
Who was I talking to the other day? I was talking to somebody, and it was basically saying that dietitians would much rather ask about like your poop than your religious beliefs. And I hear you chuckling, right? Like they would rather like ask you what like excrement is coming out, whatever orifice we're talking about. Like we'd rather ask that than like, what do you believe spiritually? Mm-hmm. And I think a big part of it is because we were raised saying that religion is taboo. And so you don't ask about religion, you don't ask about politics. But whenever you take a step back and just think of religion as a culture, like in a viewpoint of the world, then it kind of takes the taboo out of it. You're like, how do you see the world? Do you think that everything that happens in life is fated to happen? Do you believe that you were fated to get diabetes? Do you believe that you can be healed of this? Or do you think that this is just a trial that you have to, or a cross you have to bear for the rest of your life? Right. So it's just a lens of how you see the world. But in terms of like faith, everybody just looks at it and they think, oh, well, I'm not going to ask about that because they believe the wrong thing, or they have their own religious beliefs. Right. And so they don't want to approach it in a way that's going to be offensive to someone else, or they don't want to be preached at. And they think if they bring up religion, they're going to be like, oh, well, do you believe in our Lord and Savior? And you're like, whoa, okay. Like, I'm just asking, do you think that faith has a role in how you view your food? And so I think people are scared of it because they haven't asked about it. They haven't necessarily thought deeply about how it could affect your diet. And just in general, they think that other people are going to be uncomfortable talking about it too.
Yeah, you said two things that it was kind of what I was thinking, like, well, we don't want to offend anybody. And, you know, we have a few minutes to see this patient, or maybe it's just a casual conversation with a friend or an acquaintance. And you think, oh, I don't want to be here 3 hours getting preached at. Yeah.
Right.
But again, to our previous point is that, you know, just kind of asking some questions and opening up that conversation. I know one of the biggest takeaways I had from my conversation with Connie Riggs was not being afraid to ask and just listening. And at a basic level, that can help that person feel comfortable. In fact, Connie said, if you don't ask about their cultural foods or their cultural habits and how that impacts their lifestyle, that might offend them.
Well, and you're doing a disservice, right?
Right.
Because your whole purpose is to help them. And if you don't know them, you can't help them.
Right. Right.
Like I was telling somebody else, there's no generic people. So there's no generic diet, right? Like you can't just say, well, eat tomatoes and cucumbers. It's like, well, we don't have tomatoes where I'm from. You know, like it just, or I've never eaten tomatoes before, or I don't like tomatoes.
Right. Yeah. So asking questions. What other advice besides just asking questions and kind of approaching it in a non-judgmental way would you have for healthcare professionals listening, or if, you know, just the general public who, you know, maybe they want to open this conversation with their healthcare provider or life coach or whoever they're talking with? What advice would you have for them?
The first thing that I would say is that if you make it a big deal, then it's going to seem like it's a big deal. And just as an educator, I think this way. So, Melissa, I don't know if you've had this experience where somebody's like, can I ask you, I don't want to offend you, but can I ask you a question? And it's kind of offensive to some people, but it's not offensive. And you're like, okay, what is this question?
Where are we going here?
Like, this is going to be real weird, real fast, right? Yeah. But if somebody just says, hey, Melissa, so I was thinking about this, and what are your thoughts? Then you're just like, oh, okay, well, this is what I think about it. But if you make it a big deal whenever you're asking somebody about their faith, you're like, okay, so I know some people don't want to talk about faith, and I know that some people don't understand how it could relate to food, but I was just wondering if potentially maybe you kind of would like to discuss faith. Like that's going to be really weird for that individual.
Yeah.
But if you say, I understand that faith can play a role in some people's approach to diets, do you think that that may be the case with you? And they say yes or no. And if they say no, it's like, okay, you just move on. And if they say yes, then you can say, how would you think that it affects you? And they'll say, well, you know, I believe that we should be eating just the grains of the field and we shouldn't be focused on the meats. And so I focus on being a vegetarian and mainly vegan, but vegetarian because sometimes I'll use butter. You know, and right there you're like, okay, so you are a vegetarian or a vegan, and that is based on religious beliefs. So that's not like I can put that in my brain bank and realize that whenever we're talking about health, that I can bring that back into our conversation.
Yeah. In that example, it can help you make sure that somebody's not making those decisions because maybe they don't have the facts right, or they think they need to avoid a certain food or beverage because from a nutritional standpoint, or from, you know, a good food or bad food standpoint. I mean, that's a big difference,
right?
For the reason.
Well, yeah, if you have somebody come in and they're a vegan because they think it's cool, that's different than if somebody comes in and they're a vegan because that's their religious belief.
Right.
And how you approach that's going to be totally different.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think the other part is what you asked was, if you're somebody that wants to bring it up with a medical provider, right? If you want to bring it up to a physician or a dietitian or a health coach, like how do you do that? I think people have to remember that they are part of their medical care. They're not just the recipient of it. And so they should be comfortable talking about who they are with the person that is providing that care for them so that they can get the best care possible.
Absolutely. I always say, because I work a lot with people with diabetes, and especially I think in that dynamic, they're typically working with a team, and I'm like, you're driving the bus. The team is riding along. You're driving the bus, and just empowering them to take a more active role. And I've had patients say, well, I wanted to talk to my doctor about this, and he kind of didn't want to talk about it. And I'm like, well, you might want to find a different doctor, because it's really important for you to be able to share. In this one case in particular that I'm thinking about, the medication that the doctor prescribed was literally not going to work with this woman's schedule. It wasn't that it was hard for her to do, or she was forgetting, or anything behaviorally. It literally did not jive with her schedule. And I said, if your doctor understands this, I'm sure they'll be willing to try something different that does work for you, because if you can't take it, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, right. But at the same time, people are like, well, this is what he told me. And so they think that's the only option.
Yeah. Right.
And if there are other options, then we can try something else. But if I don't know I need to try something else, then this is the best one that I can think of, Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's weird that a lot of people don't think about changing doctors. They're like, well, this is my doctor.
It's hard.
Well, why? It's because that's the one that you've chosen.
Right?
Right?
You know how it is. The known is known, and the unknown could be a lot worse. It could be a lot better, but it's hard.
Yeah, I usually give the example of if your hairstylist just butchered your hair and it was horrible. Like, would you go back to that hairstylist? No, you wouldn't. Like, you're like, well, there's a different person that could do a better job.
Yeah, oh no, that is not happening again. I mean, can't almost everybody relate to that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That's a great analogy. Oh my gosh. Okay. That's perfect.
And just so you know, you can use that whenever you want. Like,
I will, because you know what? That's happened to me. That has happened to me. I just got my hair cut yesterday, and the guy who's cutting my hair, I've been seeing him for like 20 years. And it drives my husband crazy because I still drive an hour to go back and see him. But it's only once every 6 weeks. The reason I started seeing him was because the lady who'd been cutting my hair forever, for whatever reason, my hair was normally shoulder length. I walked out that day and it was like chin length, like short. And I'm like, she had me facing away from the mirror the whole time. She turned me around and I was like, holy moly, what just happened? And I was like, I am not going back to her. And the funny thing is, she owns the salon. So I went to somebody else at the same salon, and so I still get to see her every 6 weeks. But
like the passion that you feel about that, like, why don't we feel that about our doctor? Right? Where it's just like, well, it's visible. Like, this is how I look. This is me, right? Well, when really your doctor is literally caring for you.
Yeah, and your insides and the things. I mean, yeah, our
like
hair, our appearance matters, but this other thing. But you know how it is. I think it's getting better, but I think people still typically put their physicians on a pedestal. And
sure. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust your physician because they didn't listen to you or whatever. I mean, I'm just saying that you are a part of your medical care.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you should go in having looked up and printed off everything from WebMD and you're like, let me tell you something, because you're not a doctor, right? But you should be a part of the care that you're getting.
Yeah, Dr. Google is not a good resource.
Neither is Google Dietitian.
Right, there you go. Google RD.
Google RD.
Very good. Well, I know you talk about faith on your show a lot. And by the way, I love your voice on the show. People can hear it here. It's a great podcasting voice. And I really like the music that you have on the show. You do such a great job with that. My show, the music is just the intro and the outro, written by a friend of mine from high school, Dave Burke. Awesome. It was fun to kind of collaborate and make that happen. But you use music throughout the show, and it's very emotional and dramatic and uplifting. And so I wanted to just mention that. But you talk a lot about faith on the show. And I'm not a Latter-day Saint. I'm a Methodist. A lot of what you talk about, I know it's biblical, and I don't remember that story, but you still apply it in a way that it applies to anyone.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about the podcast and the types of topics and guests that you have on and kind of what your idea, your dream is for the show.
Oh, that's a big question. Okay. We'll start at the beginning, I guess. So the podcast is the Latter-day Saint Nutritionist Podcast. And part of that is that I'm a Latter-day Saint, and that's kind of how I have read through the scriptures, right? But at the same time, like you mentioned, it's not just for people that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's for people that are interested in how faith is going to influence what they do, or just through being able to understand nutrition a little bit differently. So one of my favorite episodes that I've done is called the Brazen Serpent Diet. And it's just briefly, all that's happening is that in the scriptures, Moses is leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, and then they start being disobedient, and there's these serpents that come out that will bite them, and they're poisonous, and if they get bit, then they're going to pass away, right? But there's a way provided for them to be healed, and all they have to do is look at this bronze serpent that Moses has put on a staff, and they'll be healed. And so I look at that, and in terms of nutrition, really all that you have to do is eat more plants, and you'll be so much better off. But in society, we're like, no, that's too simple. Mm-hmm. Just like the children of Israel, they're like, no, that's too simple. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want to know, is it organic? Is it locally sourced? What was the farmer's name that grew this? Is it a nightshade? Is it alkaline? Is it not? Is it grown and so there's so many other things where you're trying to really complicate it, but it's just a simple thing. Mm. And so I try to use different stories or principles like that to explain nutrition. And so I will talk about culturally what people do. I'll talk about diabetes and how that works. And in doing it, I want to provide a place where people can get the information that they may not have got from their medical provider. Because I don't know about you, but there's so many times that you are talking to somebody that has an illness and they have no idea what is happening or what it means or why it's doing that. Mm-hmm. And so as a podcast host and as an educator and as a dietitian, I want to provide the information to say, this is what hypertension is. It's the same thing as high blood pressure. And they're like, oh, I never knew that, right? And then I'll go through and I'll explain diabetes and how there's different types of diabetes and how diabetes doesn't just mean insulin. There's different things that can start to occur. And so I do that, but I will blend in different scripture verses to talk about how we should lift where we stand or grow where you are. And then another big one that I focus on is being comfortable with who you are. Because we have bodies, right? And regardless of where you think the body came from or where you think it's going to go, it is a body that you have here and now.
That's why we're here.
Right. Right. And so you have this body. If your view of the world is that you came to this world to get a body, then why are you going to spend your entire existence hating it? Mm-hmm. Or you think that after this world, you're going to get your body back, but it'll be perfect? What does perfect look like if you spend your entire life hating it? And will you still be looking for things that are going to be wrong? Because that's the mentality that you've developed over the past 70 years. Just thinking, oh, well, I wish this was smaller. I wish I didn't have this jiggle. I wish my hair was a little longer. My nose has a little bit of a bump. I wish it wasn't there. You're always looking for faults. And if that's the person that you are developing, not just the body, but the person, then how does that affect the eternal perspective?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're basically doing storytelling and creating
That's
analogies.
Really what it is.
I love it. Yeah.
Because everybody understands a story, mm-hmm. and you hear it in different ways, and at different times you might understand it in a deeper level, mm-hmm. right? And so I try to present information in a way where people can take it in a light way, but whenever they're ready to feel it in a deep way, they get it.
And you really do. I mean, I've listened to several of your episodes, and I've always felt uplifted, and you really do address that whole person, and whether it's the spiritual aspect or our relationship with food or body acceptance, it's really coming from a very positive perspective.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also do quite a bit of public speaking, and there was one topic that you speak on that really caught my eye, so I wanted to ask you about it. You have twin daughters. How old are they?
Yes. They are 18 months next week.
Wow. Little.
Yeah, they're awesome.
Precious. So one of the topics that you speak on is daddies, daughters, and diets.
Right.
And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that. Why that topic? I mean, obviously your daughters are too young to be dieting, but it sounds like you're ready for when those days might come along.
Yeah, well, you have to think about, like, as men are kind of like in this own world off to the side where they're not getting the same diet messages that women are. And so whenever men see it, they're like, oh, okay, this would be helpful or not, or whatever. I just want to eat what I want to eat. Whereas women have been like bombarded with, well, is that saturated fat? Is that polyunsaturated fat? You know, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. Mm-hmm. And they hear all these different things from whether it's their mother or their aunt or their friends that are talking about their bodies their entire life. And men don't necessarily think about that. Men think, okay, so my body changes occur at puberty, maybe right when I've finished puberty, and then if I get a beer belly. Those are the body changes that happen in men. Whereas with women, you have a body change, puberty, and then a body change if you start potentially taking a contraceptive, right? And then whenever you get pregnant, and then when you're not pregnant, and then if you get pregnant again, and then when you're not pregnant again, and then when you hit menopause. And so there's like so many different times where a woman's body changes, but men don't ever have to think about that. And so those types of things are what I try to address. And the other one is eating disorders, because men will just think that women are getting healthy. Mm-hmm. They're not really seeing that, oh, well, they're having an unhealthy relationship with food. It's like, well, I'm proud of you. Especially if looking at their daughter, they're like, you know what, you're doing so good. I'm proud of you, like trying to get healthy. And then it gets to the point where they're like, I didn't even see that you weren't eating at all.
Mm-hmm. So you're really trying to help fathers kind of read between the lines or pull back the curtain and see what their daughters might be going through or might be exposed to in the media and social media.
Yeah, and not just their daughters, but I mean, I bring in, and I'll talk about mothers and grandmothers too. Because a lot of times you'll be trying to send good messages to your daughters, and you're not talking about their size necessarily, but you're like, you know what, I'm glad that you aren't overweight. And so to them, you're like, whoa, okay, I shouldn't have said that, because now they think that I would value them less if they're overweight. Or the other thing is that they'll say like one daughter's a smart daughter and the other daughter's a pretty daughter. Mm-hmm. And you're like, whoa, so that means that the other one's not smart and that one's not pretty.
Right.
And so the messaging that we send can be there. And even if the dad isn't sending those messages, somebody is. Mm-hmm. So you need to be there to be a spokesperson for who they are is enough.
Mm-hmm. So you're really going beyond the body image, the dieting aspect, and you're really trying to empower them to just be a support person for their family members, their daughters, their moms, their wives, grandmothers, to not put labels and put them in a box based on how smart they are or how they look.
Right.
That's really important. I remember, I've told the story on the podcast, but it's been a while, when my daughter, who's now a freshman in college, when she was kind of going through puberty and her appetite fluctuated. So I met her when she was 7 years old. She was from my husband's first marriage. And so I adopted her when we got married. And I always was impressed with the fact that she just had such a great sense of, she ate when she was hungry. She stopped when she was full. Even if it was like her favorite food or something, when she was full, she stopped. And I just thought, oh, if she could just keep that, that'd be so powerful. And like I said, when she went through puberty, her appetite fluctuated, as is normal. Right. And there were a couple of times when, you know, she'd have a great big burger if we went out to eat or something. And my husband, one time in particular, was like, wow, that's a big burger. And I literally kicked him under the table. Like, dude, no, I don't want her being self-conscious because she's hungry and she's eating a big burger. You know, it'd be different if she did that every day, whatever. But, you know, right. it just wasn't an issue. And I had to kind of tell him, look, even with our son, my husband and I are always trying to lose 10 to 15 pounds, but we can't talk about that in front of the kids. You know, we don't say the D word. We don't say diet. We don't, you know, pinch our bellies and say, oh, I got to lose a few pounds. You know, we do a great job being role models with exercise and trying to role model healthy eating. But that's pretty much where it's got to stop. Like, we can't walk around saying what's really on our minds, because I don't want the kids to, have this like negative tracks in their heads.
Well, and a lot of times it can be subconscious, because the messaging is, and I see this all the time, where older ladies will say, oh, whenever I was your age, I just remember I was so beautiful, which means that when you get old, you're no longer beautiful. And I remember giving a talk, and there was a 70-year-old lady who came up to me, and it was about body positivity. And she was like, I've been waiting 70 years to hear that. And I've been struggling with it my entire life. And people have never told me that it's okay just to eat. Wow. Because I'm hungry.
Did you share
but
that?
You're at 70.
Yeah. Did you share that on one of your podcasts? Because I
believe so. Yeah.
That was really powerful.
But we think the messaging is just for daughters. Right. We're just like, well, they just need to know this. But it's really not just for young people. We think that whenever you're old, you are somehow immune, and you understand that Photoshop is out there, and you're smarter and really media savvy to know that that's not real. But old people talk more about their bodies than young people do. It's just a different way of talking about it.
Very interesting. Yeah. And obviously, eating disorders and body image issues predominantly affect women. But I just recently saw a Real Sports show, and it was on our DVR. So I don't know. I think it actually came out pretty recently, because I was tweeting about it. And it was about male athletes and eating disorders. Did you happen to see it?
I didn't, but yeah.
It was so compelling. The whole show, it's Real Sports is it Bryant Gumbel? It's a great show. Talk about storytelling. That's a great show. I watch it with my husband and my son. So they were talking about like these extreme athletes, but then there was one story in particular about male eating disorders. And oh my gosh, I was just in tears, because it was so sad. But my point being that there is a growing number of men, boys, who are starting to have body image issues. And especially when you look at athletes, they're more at risk. And having been a ballet dancer, I can see that like very, very clearly. And I don't do sports nutrition. But before this show aired a couple months ago, I did a podcast episode on boys and body image. If anybody's interested, I interviewed 2 dietitians.
I loved that one. And I was like, I want to be on the table talking about this.
We should have had a man join us. Yeah.
Well, if you want to do a repeat, I'm more than happy to sign up for that.
Okay, we should. We really should. It really struck a chord with a lot of people. That was an example of a listener dietitian who came to me and said, we're both boy moms. I'd love to talk about this topic. And it was Amy Reed. And I said, this sounds really interesting, but neither one of us are kind of an expert in this area. So we brought in Heather Mangieri, who works with athletes of all ages, but a lot of teens. So we should do a 2.0 and bring a male perspective on. That would be great.
Well, so I did a previous podcast where I interviewed a health coach, and she was talking very much about body positivity. She has daughters, and she's like, oh, I taught this messaging to my daughters, so they even pass it around to their friends. They're like, you don't talk negative about your body. And I asked her, because she had sons, said, well, what about your sons? And she's like, oh, don't worry. They know too. They don't talk about their wives like that. And they treat women with respect and all these things. And I said, but did you ever ask them if they have body issues? She was like, well,
I heard that podcast. I was
right. And you're just like,
that's a good question.
Right. And she was like, I don't know that I ever did.
Yeah. She was kind of blown away. Like, wow.
But the reality is that people don't ask guys.
Right.
I don't know if I've told this story before, but I know my wife and I were walking through Disney like a year ago or something. And there's this guy walking, and behind him is this girl who I assume was his girlfriend, maybe wife. I don't know, just a friend. But she's pinching him up the side of his abdomen going, chup, 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 chup. And I tell this story to my students. I'm like, what do you think would have happened if a guy had been walking behind the girl going chup, 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 right? And they're all like, oh, that man would have been slapped, right? But you don't think the guy has the same feelings about this?
Sure.
And the reality is they just don't have a place to talk about it.
Right.
Right. You ask a guy how he feels about his body, and he's like, you mean this beautiful specimen?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. And it becomes a joke.
Right.
And even if you were serious about it, then everybody else would shut it down. And they're like, man, stop being ridiculous.
Right. So if faith is taboo, boys and body image is even more.
I'm all about the taboo stuff, I
love
guess.
it. I love it.
Now, but you mentioned sports. So I talked about this in one of my classes, and I had a student who was an MMA fighter. And it's very prevalent in wrestling too, because you have to make a weight, right?
What's MMA?
MMA is mixed martial arts.
Mixed martial arts.
Okay, so like this is what you're going to be watching if you're watching like Conor McGregor whenever he's fighting people in the octagon. It's like boxing, but you can kick too.
Okay, but this isn't like the WWF and all that stuff.
No, this isn't like
real.
wrestling. Yeah, no, this is real. I don't watch it because it's so real.
Oh.
And it's just painful to watch. But this student was like, oh yeah, whenever I'm trying to make weight, I don't eat for like a week. And then I'll take water pills to do all this other stuff to make weight. And then he said, but once I make weight, I just binge and I eat everything. And we talked about it because to him, that's totally normal.
Right.
Because all of his friends in his community and the culture of people that he follows are doing just that.
Right.
But if you take a step back, you're like, that is disordered eating. Maybe you do not have a diagnosable eating disorder, but that's not healthy.
Right.
But to everyone else, he's an MMA fighter. He's ripped. He's young. He's an athlete.
He's
healthy.
dedicated.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we glorify.
He's focused.
But that's not healthy.
Right. Absolutely.
But one more thing that I wanted to bring up while I have it on my mind is you mentioned that you and your husband were really good at being the exercise people to help out with your kids. So there's research that shows that men are really good with the exercise, but they're not good in the kitchen. So women will be like, okay, well, we're going to be healthy. We're going to be eating these things because they're the primary grocery shoppers, right? They come home, they've got these meals set out, and then the dad's like, well, I mean, that was good, but do you guys want to go get some ice cream or donuts?
Totally.
Right? And so it kind of like undermines what the wife is doing. And the argument is, well, if the wife just made healthier foods, I would eat healthier. But it never works out that way because the woman will always, well, typically, the woman will buy what the people will eat. And if she's buying healthy stuff and it's all just going bad, then she's going to stop buying it because that's money, right?
Yeah.
And those are the types of things that like I'll talk about is that men just think that it's someone else that should be doing things, but men should be in the kitchen too.
Absolutely.
Like they should be comfortable cooking or they should be comfortable eating healthy foods and not just saying, oh, well, this tastes like bark.
Right. Right.
But being there to talk about having healthy foods and not just, well, I'll just go exercise and get skinny again. Because that's not health.
Okay, so my husband just opened the door. We're going to cut this out. I'm still podcasting. You understand that, don't you? He's bringing me soup. Like I can eat soup while I'm... Okay, maybe we'll leave this in. You just had to make a cameo, Mark.
That's perfect.
Hi.
Hey, Mark,
bye.
how's it going?
Oh, my gosh. Oh, wow. Okay. I was going to say, actually did not lose my train of thought. I was going to say, I love that you are encouraging men to get into the kitchen. And yeah, both parents need to be good role models with food and exercise. And yeah, those side comments definitely don't help. We are lucky in our family because my husband was a single dad and he grew up eating pretty healthy foods. And so he definitely knows his way around the kitchen. And whenever it's time to grill, he's the grill master. I definitely am like, honey, you're doing
it's
the
funny
grilling.
How that's like the thing, right? Like men grill and women cook. Like, I don't know. Okay, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But, and then with the exercise, what I really like about how we are role models is that sometimes we'll exercise together. We've done some races and stuff together. We did a triathlon together. But for the most part, we have our own interests. And he does a lot of sports related activities and I do a lot of non-sports related activities.
Right.
My son's in basketball and baseball and soccer and my husband will coach soccer and the basketball. So that's great too. And so our kids get to see a variety and we actually have a little workout room in our house where I'll be in there lifting weights and my son will come in and play basketball, so we really try to do family activities as well, but a variety of things. And well, it's
just like having fun. Whenever you just view workout as like pain and torture,
right.
then you're not going to keep doing it.
Right. And our kids see that Mark loves going off the paddle. I love going to ballet and that we really enjoy those things and that we encourage them to find things that they enjoy. And one of the neighborhood moms asked me to come over and talk about her son's weight and eating habits. He's about my son's age. And one of the things that she brought up is that, she's like this petite, perfectly proportioned gal, and her son is just a big kid. Okay. Like he's going to be a football hero. Okay. And he's not overweight. He's a big kid. But, you know, he's got some eating habits that need to be looked at. She was saying how she stopped going to the gym to work out and she does it at home so they see her. And I thought, you might want to be careful because it's the son and 2 daughters. I'm like, you might just want to be careful about them seeing, well, mom eats perfectly and mom exercises and we don't like to quote unquote exercise. I mean, the boy's in sports, so that's great,
right.
You know, and, you know, we don't like to eat all this healthy food, but mom does. And I just wanted her to kind of be aware you're trying to be a good role model, but you might be sending a message that is negative to them. And just one example too, it was right around Halloween. And, she said that, you know, she took all the candy. Our school has this candy trade-in thing. I don't know what they do with the candy. We keep ours, you know, we hide it in the cabinet, but we don't give it to food shelters or anything because they need healthy food, not candy. But she's like, yeah, you know, so I told the kids, I took the candy in and, you know, I let them have whatever they wanted for day 1 or 2 days or however many. And then I took the candy in to the school. And she tells me, she said, it was really hard for me to do, but I'm glad I did it. And I said, did you tell them it was hard for you?
Right.
And she goes, no. And I said, I think that would really go a long way, that it was still hard for you to do it. But once the candy was gone, it's easier when it's not at home, calling your name and just tempting you. And so I encouraged her to
Kids are a lot smarter than people give them credit for. Yeah. And I'm not just saying this woman. I just mean in general, like all of us.
Yeah, I think it's important.
Conversations with them.
Yeah, and just to be real and to be honest and not to kind of come off as kind of having it all together and, you know, being perfect.
That's really whenever I grew in a lot of respect for my dad. I was 16 and he was like, you know what, Zach? I just got here before you. Like, I'm still trying to figure it out too. And I was like, well, oh.
Wow.
Oh, Wait,
that was
so
wise of him to say.
Okay, right. But at the same time, it was just like, it wasn't a big thing. It was just like, yeah, I'm trying.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay.
That's great.
Now we're like in it together rather than like he's the dictator and I'm trying to bring him down.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if any other teenagers tried to do that.
Well, I'm sure it's kind of common. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so one other thing that I was thinking is that as we were talking about it and your husband brought in some soup for you,
which is sitting here getting cold. Like, what is he thinking?
I'm sorry. We'll
no, I'm not going to eat it now. I can barely drink water while I'm interviewing.
So one of the things that happens pretty frequently is that women are like, yes, men should be in the kitchen. They should be helping more. But the man goes into the kitchen and what does the woman do?
Controls it.
You're like, no, you're doing this wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's not that good. Whenever I make it, I usually do this. And you're like, okay, well, I'm making it, right? Like I'm here learning or I'm here trying or I'm here doing this. And so it's a two-way street. Like it's difficult because the man has to be vulnerable and willing to try, but the woman also has to be accepting that the man is not perfect.
Absolutely.
So it's just like, just keep that in mind when, yes, you do want it. But at the same time, you've got to be willing to accept it whenever it comes in.
Yes. And I'll just add one more thing to that. Sometimes when the man, and maybe it's the other way too, but sometimes when the man is helping out with cooking or helping out with laundry, they make a really big mistake because they're secretly hoping that you will fire them from that job and never let them in again and don't let them fool you.
Yeah, I don't remember where I heard that, but it was like, if you make a mistake, then you never have to keep it going back.
I've lived
and
yes.
Some people do that, but if they're in good faith trying to move forward, just support them.
Yeah, or don't let them just like, oh, honey, you bleached all of our dark towels. That's okay. You'll do better next time. Oh, yeah. I'm like, wait a minute. You were a single dad. You know how to do all this stuff. What's with this big bleach error? Like, that's suspicious.
Yeah. Well, I know we were supposed to talk more about faith. I'm sorry, but I realized like this is the reality of my podcast too, is that like, yes, I talk about faith as an influencer on what we do, but it's not everything.
Right. Well,
right. And I think that's the big part is that it's part of who we are, but it might not dictate every single thing that you do all the time.
Right. And again, that culture. You had said to me before the show that culture is not limited to race, location, socioeconomic status. It's really your environment around you, the way you were raised, faith plays into that, who we choose to spend our time with impacts that, family members that you can't pick, choose, right. All of that has an impact on our lives.
Yeah, it really does. And whenever you treat people like people, then they're more able to get things done. Mm-hmm. Like your friend that couldn't take that medication. Mm-hmm. If she acts like a person and is like, look, I'm not a robot. The reality is that I can't do this. It's not that I'm unwilling. Right. I want to get better. I want to do what I need to, but genuinely, I can't take this medication. Mm-hmm. Right. Then the doctor is going to say, okay, well, let's figure out what you can do.
Absolutely. And the doctor can't do that if he or she doesn't know that it's an issue.
Right.
Tell me about your new book, The Creation Code. What inspired you to write it, and what can people find in it?
So the Creation Code is about behavior change and about using, again, principles that you can learn from the scriptures in creating the change that you want to see in your life. So the whole idea is that it uses the stages of change model, whether you're in pre-contemplation, contemplation, like where you are in your willingness to change. And it uses the 7 days of creation or the 7 creative periods to help you to make the change that you're looking for. So you can learn something from each one of the days. And just to start out, it's like the separation of light and dark. So what do you want and what don't you want? And some people can say, I don't want this. I know I don't want this. I don't know what I do want, but I know I don't want this. Maybe it's diabetes or cancer or any number of things. And so from there, you take it and say, well, what I'm willing to do is that I'm willing to go walk my dog for 30 minutes a day. Or I'm willing to learn more about what causes those things. And so I will get more information. And from there, it takes you into setting goals and how to set realistic goals that are attainable. And then it talks about the fruits that you're looking for. And what I mean by that is whenever you start working out, most people, the only thing they're looking for is, does the number on the scale go down? Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't, then I'm a failure.
It's not working.
And if it doesn't, then it's not working and it's too hard. So why keep it up?
Right.
Why not just like go back to eating anything that I want and it's all fine? But understanding that that's not the only outcome, right? So insulin sensitivity can go up. Your ability to have a more aerobic capacity, your ability to play with your kids or your grandkids, or to go out and play frisbee or paddleboard or whatever it is that you want to do, your capacity has increased. And so setting goals and recognizing the rewards is a big part of it. And then it shifts into like, how do we think about ourselves? Because you can set goals and you can change how you behave. But if you don't change how you see yourself, then you just think you're an imposter. And you're like, well, I'm not a chef, but I mean, I try to cook. Well, I'm not a runner, but I do run every once in a while. It's like, if you're a runner, you're a runner, right? So the book is really about creating change that you are looking for, but doing it in a way that's sustainable. And that's just using the principles that are already there in the 7 days of creation to help you get there.
So it sounds like you're getting into sort of getting more clarity on your values and trying to align your life and your behaviors and your beliefs with those values?
Yeah, you could say that. It's more so just about how do you create the person that you want to be? Because you're in the driver's seat. A lot of people think that, well, in order for me to be healthy, this needs to happen and that should change. But it's like, what can you do to create the health that you're looking for? And health isn't a number on a scale. It's a collection of habits that you have.
Those action steps and
right.
One step at a time and working those habits and creating new habits.
Yeah, a lot of it is information that's already out there, but this is packaged in a way that is going to be understandable and relatable to people that are going to look through the lens of faith in order to make those changes. So you can read books on SMART goals, and that's fine. But until you find a way that it is applicable to you, it may not be something that you're going to internalize and start to put into practice.
Right. Well, and we all know how hard behavior change is. So any compelling perspective or approach is important because it's hard work, but there has to be that underlying deep, meaningful reason and motivation in order to stay on that path.
Right. And not to get too religious on this podcast, but it's like, if you believe in Christ and you think that he died for you, then you're worth whatever change you would like to implement. And you're worth who you are, right? I mean, like, you don't have to lose weight to be worth it to him. He didn't just die for skinny people or die for fat people. Like, he was willing to sacrifice himself for everybody, right? So, like, that's one of the ways that you can look at it. And when people start to think of it in that way and they have a religious background, they're like, yeah, that makes sense, because I was only valuing me based on what I'm capable of rather than seeing the eternal perspective.
And I think that's a really important point that you make, and I've heard you address it on your show, is helping people see their worth today as they are. Because until they can do that, I think it's really challenging to be good to themselves, until we can do that, it's challenging for us to be good to ourselves if we don't feel worthy.
Right. I run into this with my students. They're like, well, now that the semester's over and I have all this information, now I'm going to make a change. And other times people will say, well, now like that I've lost 10 pounds, I can go get a gym membership. Mm-hmm. Or I won't get a gym membership until I lose 15 pounds. Mm-hmm. Because then I've proven to myself that I'm ready to change. Mm-hmm. And so they have like these qualifiers that say, well, this is whenever I really am ready. Mm-hmm. Like, but you're just ready whenever you change your mind.
Right. And yeah, sometimes it's, we have to stop with the learning and the education. I mean, we're always continuing to learn, but waiting for that point where we know enough to start putting things into action. You can know so much, but until you take action, you're not going to change any behaviors.
Yeah. Did you know how to podcast before you started?
Heck no. I didn't even know what one was.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, like, did you know like everything about nutrition before you decided that's the profession you wanted to go into?
Not at all.
Right. So, like, it's really just about taking those steps and then evaluating if those steps are where you still want to go.
Right.
We're always continuing to reevaluate what it is we're doing. And I'm sure you run into this too, but with patients or with clients or even with me, with students, they'll want something specific. And so they'll set a goal to get that. And then whenever they've reached their goal, maybe they realize that that's not what they were looking for. Or they don't reach their goal and they're like, well, I'm a failure.
Right.
But it's not that you're a failure. It's that you learned something from this.
Absolutely.
And it's the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. You're continuing to learn. You're not just done. Like, whenever I reach this weight, I'm healthy. Like, well, no. Like, when you reach this weight, then hopefully you have those healthy behaviors you can continue.
Absolutely. Yep. Learning as we go, tweaking our plan, what worked, what didn't work. I'm not the failure. I thought this plan would work. It didn't. So how can I adjust it so that I increase my chances of success next time around?
Right. Or Absolutely. What can I learn from this? What can I learn from my success? And what can I learn from my failure? Because maybe you recognize that you're really good at setting goals, but you're not good at keeping them if they're too long. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you can take away from the next time you're going to establish those healthy behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you need accountability. Maybe you need to break that goal up into 3 smaller pieces. Yeah, lots of
Maybe you're the
things.
person that's like, you know what? I have to organize this spin class or else I'm not going to feel responsible to do it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's fine.
Right. A lot of trial and error, that's for sure.
Right.
As we're wrapping up, what do you want our listeners to know about food and faith and science and, your podcast, your book? I know you also have a really cool conference coming up that I'd like you to share. It's called Peace in the Plate. So, kind of give us a wrap up on what you want people to know, what their takeaway is, and about this cool conference.
Yeah. Okay. So my podcast is the Latter-day Saint Nutritionist. So with food, faith, and science, the reality is that we oftentimes try to put them in different boxes. And we say, well, this is my faith day, this is my science mind, and this is my food time, and that's just me, and I'm going to do whatever I want. But we're a whole person. And so understanding that you can look at science through the lens of faith, and you can look at faith through the lens of science, and still be treated as a whole person is a big part of it. And so my podcast, again, isn't just aimed at people that are of faith or are not. It's there to, like you mentioned, to tell stories, to relate nutrition in a way where you can understand what it is that's actually being said out there from somebody who has the credentials and isn't just like, oh, well, I lost a lot of weight and you should listen to me. Mm-hmm. And so that's the focus of the podcast. The book is there to be a tool to help people take the steps to where they want to be, but to help them understand whenever they go to a professional to help them to change, these are the tools that they're using. And that's really what I want to teach people to do, is how to make the changes they're looking for rather than just being dependent upon someone else to make that change. I tell my students all the time, you can email me in 15 years if you'd like to, but I'd rather you have the skills to make the choices and understand what it is you're doing rather than having to rely on Professor Cordell. That's the hope with the podcast too, is that you can kind of sift through a lot of the pseudo information around food and health out there, because you can think critically and you understand what is really going on rather than people just using big words that you don't understand. Mm-hmm. And so that's the aim of the podcast. And the event that you mentioned, the Peace and the Plate event, is going to be happening this August in Utah. And the whole idea behind that is, to help people understand that food is not the enemy. I'm sure you run into this too, Melissa, where people are like, I just get hungry. Mm-hmm. And they say hungry like it's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But hunger is just your body's normal physiological response to not having food. And so you have to eat. But we're at war with our foods, and we're at war with the scale. And a lot of times different gyms will use that to their advantage to say, you just need to beat your body into submission because you're the boss here. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, your body's still you. Like, it's not like it's just a problem. Your body's what's allowing you to do all the things that you do. And so the whole aim of this event is to help people to understand how to make peace with the plate and peace with their bodies and peace with food by talking about the reality of food and health, and helping people to understand what they should define as health. And maybe that's not what mainstream media is saying. Mm. A lot of people just focus on a number on the scale, but really it's just, what is it that you are doing on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. Because you can be skinny and have a heart attack, mm-hmm. and you can be overweight and still run marathons. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So that's the aim of the event and the podcast. I'd love for anybody to check it out that's interested. The book, The Creation Code, is available on Amazon. Yeah. So, I mean, it's all available. If you want to reach out, I'm more than happy to talk.
Thank you so much, Zach. And for everybody listening, I will have all the links to Zach's website, his book, his podcast. He's on Facebook and Instagram. I'll have all those links in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. Zach, thank you so much for coming on the show and having this fun conversation with me today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been awesome.
It's been a lot of fun. For everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind, and maybe a little bit of faith too. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.